And who dropped out of the race? Oh, no, we're not there yet. Act like I didn't ask that. Everyone cool? What was LBJ saying about the war? That there was what? Yeah. And so they were exaggerating how well they were doing. And what were the long, hot summers? Riots all over the country. What was the movement to propose, or the idea that people should respect Black lives? No, hey, this is not the time to do the practice test. You're doing that on your own. Okay. So put that away. The disproportionate reaction. What? And with that, what was it called? Where the idea of Black was beautiful, promoting Black power, and what else? Yeah, Black consciousness and Black nationalism. Who's one of the leaders of that? Stokely. We're close. Carmichael. We're so close. All right, so there's Kennedy. Well, LBJ, soon after that happened, shocking everybody, dropped out of the race. And this would change the election of 1968. It's hard to imagine LBJ dropping out after winning the biggest election, and nobody in American history before and since have passed more laws. We could say some of the laws weren't quite 100% complete, but nobody was more powerful. Yeah, oh yeah, doesn't help after hindsight, wonderful. Shocked everybody. And for the first time, he talked about peace in Vietnam and talked about opening up peace talks between the four different parties: Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and the U.S. Where did I tell you they're always going to have a treaty? In Paris. So this was a big deal. And he said, if this war and peace, I can't run a campaign while this is going on. The war broke. The war broke Lyndon Johnson. And it was this giant was gone. It's really an amazing tragedy. Tragedy. I'm not making a value judgment. Just all these, winning that big election, then falling apart. Well, with that, the election became very interesting. But Martin Luther King, 2 weeks after this, and he'd come out very much against the war. He was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support a sanitation workers' strike. Unions are very pro-worker. The sanitation workers in Memphis were horrifically treated. Most of them were African Americans. And he also was there to promote, he had planned a massive march on Washington, D.C. called the Poor Persons March, to demand equal economic rights, and which he saw as the most important civil right for all Americans. And planned this large march on Washington, D.C. And here he is in Memphis. There would be a couple times that white counter protesters would attack him. He was hit with a brick. He gave his last speech on the night of April 4th or April 3rd, 1968. Now, some of you might have seen these pictures before, but sanitation workers, because they're treated, and they said like dogs, and after reading about it, they were treated like dogs. And that is why they walk with those signs saying, I'm a man. And you'll see people will show this and they'll have it with the civil rights movement. Well, yeah, this is a civil right, but it was a strike. It was a strike by sanitation workers who were carrying this, who were carrying those signs. And pretty powerful meaning. But it was about all working people, regardless of color, was why Martin Luther King was there. Yes, and they called out the National Guard, as you can see right here. Well, the next day, April 4th, at the Lorraine Hotel, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was gunned down from an apartment building that was about a block away. And you see his advisors there on the balcony pointing to where the shots came from. They were doing that because there were police all over, hiding in the woods, hiding in the hedges, watching King, not to protect him, hoping he would do something they could arrest him. And so they came out with their guns pointed at them. And that's why they're going, no, no, the shot's over there. Well, the killer got away. He would eventually get into Canada, and then he would be caught in Spain and sent back to the United States. But the night that happened, oh, the killer was James Earl Ray. I know there's something about assassins. And so we have to have, B. Harvey Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, James Earl Ray. Now, it appears though he acted alone, but he might have had a little bit of help getting out of the country. There was a couple different kind of white supremacy movements that offered a $100,000 and $200,000 reward for someone who murdered King. He was an escaped prisoner. He had fled to Mexico, come back. He was in California, then drove across country to do this killing. And the King family and a lot of people believe that the FBI actually did it, and it wasn't James Earl Ray. I empathize with him. I really do. But no, it appears to be him. The reason they thought the FBI did is because the FBI, from the very moment King became known, they were illegally spying and wiretapping everything he did his entire life and sending him threatening notes, including in 1965. The FBI sent him an anonymous note. We know now it's the FBI. So this comes from the very top, J. Edgar Hoover. And the FBI sent a note saying, we know what you have done. We know what kind of person you are. What kind of person they claimed he was a communist, and he had had many extramarital affairs. He lived life like literally this is going to be his last night. Because there's so many assassination attempts. Yeah. They told him this, they said, you have to commit suicide with people. So the FBI tried to get King to kill himself. And so when the King family, his descendants, found out about them, it's perfectly understandable why they believe the FBI did. And not to diminish the harassment he took from the government, including that means indirectly Lyndon Johnson, who was his ally. But it was James Earl Ray. And here? Oh, I must have accidentally moved it. All over the country that night of his assassination, I don't know the screen of this. There were one of the most horrific nights of rioting at the entire country. People came out and just in anger about this. Even though King had lost popularity because it seemed like he didn't do enough direct action, it's just one of the worst nights. And you could see this is kind of like too many a feeling of ending of the civil rights movement. It didn't, but it felt like it. A moment in American history that we could never get back, but we're not done yet. I should add that there were a significant number of people who said that King had it coming. In fact, I watched this whole interview thing where they had all these interviews of people saying, well, he was kind of uppity, which is intensely prejudiced statement. But I want to give you an idea of this. Here's Gallup polls, and it shows his unfavorable rating. In August 63, his unfavorable rating in the United States was 63%. And polls had it between 60 and 70% other polls. And so there were a lot of people, wish I didn't have to do color of skin, but it was by color of skin, a lot of it were mad at him, even though there were a lot of African Americans thought he was too peaceful, not enough direct action. And I just found that fascinating. This is 2011, but the polls aren't much different. How many people now, it's almost like knee-jerk, they're for him. And I always wonder how many would have been against them actually when it was going on. Yeah.
How accurate are the polls?
You got to take it with a grain of salt. So the figure, people were more truthful. It was more, they had landlines and people actually responded more to polls than today. So probably slightly more accurate. So you think,
Sorry, I really meant how biased was the survey.
well, they figure these Gallup polls. Oh, these Gallup polls have an air rating of 3 or 4%. That's what they figure. So he figures anywhere from 59 to 67%. They mathematically go through, and that's how they call names, and they call from a cross section of people as part of a wider poll. That's how they do it today. And always with a grain of salt. Today's a little bit harder because of cell phones, and people don't answer their cell phones as much, and then they don't know the numbers. I mean, do you? No one had caller ID. Now we look at it and say, oh, there's a call from Washington, D.C. I'm not answering that. I do that, and I know it's polls. I've been getting this phone call from St. Louis. I know it's a poll. Just don't want to answer the poll. So basically, just 2 months later, after winning the California primary, Robert King. And on top of his brother dying, but Martin Luther King being assassinated, this was just, it seemed like people talked about this being the death of the dream. I think that's a little bit extreme. It was 1 a.m. in the morning in California. I know 1 a.m. in the morning. What else would it be? And he just got done on national television. He won the very tightly contested California primary. And he was going into the Democratic convention, therefore, with a lot of momentum. It didn't mean he was going to win the convention. The presidents were still decided at the convention. But he had a very good shot. He just got done announcing it right here. This is a screenshot of the brand new video. Video was new. He just turned and walked off, going down through the hallways, behind the stage, near the kitchen. Sirhan unloaded a revolver for about 5. Well, it started about 10 feet. It was kind of running towards him. There were over 20 witnesses there. This was a busboy. It was one of the first persons there. It just happened to be there. This is seconds after Kennedy was shot, trying to resuscitate him. He died soon after. Sirhan was the murderer. There are some people today claim there was a conspiracy, and a lot of people believe that because they don't know what happened. They just know he was assassinated, and they know John Kennedy was assassinated. There must have been a conspiracy. No. There's no evidence of that. He was a Palestinian immigrant, and he was mad, it appears, about Kennedy's support of Israel in the Six-Day War in 1967. And that appears to be his reason. And so he would be arrested. He'd get life in prison, but when they commuted the death sentence in 1972, he would get a life sentence or get a 20-year sentence, or I'm sorry, life sentence up for parole in 20 years. He's still alive. He just came up with parole last year. He was denied. He's been denied many times. You might be thinking of Charles Manson. Those are in special topics. Same kind of thing happened to him here. But this was a sad moment. And Kennedy's death hit just as hard as King, but a different way, because it was like the last chance. And when they had the train go back to carry his body back to Washington, D.C. for the state funeral, thousands of people came out to the train to pay their respects. And there was a photographer on board who took these pictures. And it's in this book of this. And I'm not going to lie, always kind of chokes me up. But this train, all these people just came out. And these are people of all walks of life, and came out and stood at attention, said goodbye. Really sad. But this shows that 1968 was such a turbulent year. And the year before seemed like such a promising year. There would be massive protests all over the world. Student protests in Spain. Over 1,000 students would be murdered by the government in Mexico City in 1968. There were campus protests. It was just kind of this year that just kept going. And then, of course, the Tet Offensive. And so into this breach of discontent would come the new Nixon. Richard Nixon, remember, he lost in 60. He lost for governor of California in 62. And people thought he was done. But Richard Nixon did not quit. He was a tireless worker. And he worked behind the scenes to build support in the Republican Party. And literally a man left for dead emerged in 68 as the front runner, promising to unify the country. But no president in history, at least up to that time, was more divisive. He was purposely playing on the divides of the United States, of the discontents. And I should be clear, Richard Nixon was a seething pool of resentment against the wealthy, against the elite, against those who had badmouthed him. He never forgot anything. And this anger and this resentment would shape his campaign and shape the United States to this day. Richard Nixon. And so as the Democrats appear in disarray, Nixon could silently get this with a promise. With a promise to bring the country together, which he did not. He ran on the Southern strategy, and they quite openly called it that. The guy who actually coined the term actually would feel very guilty about it years later and said, "I'm really sorry." Part of it was law and order. And they said law and order with that's going to be, everybody knew what that meant, anti-civil rights. They're going to crack down on those. Remember what they were called, long on some of the race rights. But also other social issues, like the emerging counterculture and hippies, about there was increased drug use. Nothing like what's going to happen in the 70s, and certainly nothing as much as today, but there was increased. And then also anti-women's rights movement. Yeah.
What was it, so much?
That was to appeal to Southern white Democrats. But this is a nationwide campaign now. It's to appeal to the resentments that people had about the civil rights movement or the women's rights movement. Yeah. No one can really say what someone actually believed, but if you follow his history. But I guess even if you don't necessarily believe it, but you use that as a strategy, you believe it. You're willing to use that strategy. And one more thing I forgot to add. He promised peace with honor. He said he had a secret plan in Vietnam. He used the same peace with honor that Bobby Kennedy used. He had a secret plan. I can't tell you the secret plan because it's secret and the North Vietnamese know it will lose. So we have a secret plan. We know now that the secret plan was to never leave. He planned on using massive amounts of American air power to prop the government up for as long as it can. But, and he really, you can see it focused on civil rights to try to get into the South. But he really played on this resentment that many different Americans had who felt like with the civil rights movement and the growing women's rights movement, the anti-war protests, that they were being left behind, or they're just hardworking people, while others are out there crying and whining. What are they whining about? America seems great. But yeah, there were great things. But he played on that, called it the Forgotten Americans. And it was a really effective tool. He would later call it the silent majority. And in '68, the Democrats were imploding. Their convention was in Chicago in 1968. So with Kennedy now dead, the shadow of LBJ over everything and Martin Luther King's assassination, the war was on everybody's mind. They assumed thousands of anti-war protesters would come, and the party was split over the war. As it turned out, only about 11,000 anti-war protesters came. I know that might sound like a lot, but they were talking about 200,000. There were twice as many police and National Guard than there were anti-war protesters. And the police came out to just, they didn't want to just stop the anti-war protests. They wanted to get it. And so while the convention is going on, this is what's going on in the streets. These are National Guardsmen. They have gas masks because of tear gas. And so when people are watching at home, they're seeing live video intersposed with either live or videotape of these protests. And so back home, it looked like the Democrats are totally in disarray over the war. Over half of the convention, people at the convention, wanted to get out of the war. But LBJ was still president and he could not stomach that. He still had that kind of power. And the police were furious. At this protest this is not the protest. The protest in the morning before this one, there were a few anti-war protesters came and they hung up the Viet Cong flag. And the police were furious at that. They took down an American flag and hung up the Viet Cong flag, which was red, blue with a star in it. And they were seething, and they kind of attacked the protesters and then pulled back. But all that rest of the day, they were seething. As we know now, those are actually FBI plans that were infiltrated the anti-war movement to try to make the anti-war movement look bad. It was called counterintelligence or co-intel. But anyways, let's get back to this. So that night, out in front of the Hilton Hotel where they're having the convention, the anti-war protesters were having this protest. There were about 6,000 of them. Thousands of police officers got there. They took off their badges, put it in their pocket, grabbed their day sticks, those are the long sticks, and the night sticks, and waded into the crowd and beat the hell out of it. After the fact, this is going to be known as a police riot. Why'd they take off their badge? Yeah, and this was all on TV. So let's get to two things. First off, it made the new nominee, Hubert Humphrey, we'll get to Humphrey in just a second, look like he's in a party disarray. But why were the police so mad? It wasn't the Viet Cong flag. It's more important. They were resentful of those war protesters. These were the protesters, from their point of view, were these rich kids who could go to college and get out of the war, and now they're just complaining and whining because they're rich and spoiled, elites. Well, they're working class people. It's people like them who were drafted. It were people like their kids were drafted, and they go while these people can protest and fight. Now that, of course, disregards the fact that they're protesting to get your kids home. But this seething resentment is there. And nobody understood resentment more than the seething pool of resentment, Richard Nixon. And he is going to play on this so effectively that it would taint our politics until, I would say, at least noon. I can't see it ending until then. Well through this day. The vice president, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, would be the nominee. You get the HHH, get it? But everybody thought he would lose. He would be followed by protesters chanting as this, dump the hump, dump the hump. And many of these protesters didn't like Nixon, but they were mad at the war. Humphrey actually despised the war, but couldn't say it because he's the vice president. He finally came out for a peace agreement in October, beginning of October, and everything began to turn for him. And he started to do a lot better, but it was probably too late. And I don't think there's any doubt, if he would have came out in October, in August, he would have won. I have any doubt. I don't have any doubt. And he still almost won. But the Democrats were split. Remember 48? The same thing happened in 68. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, jumped in to the states' rights for the pro-segregation, the pro-Jim Crow. Now remember, state rights or segregation was mostly illegal after 64. But he came out and said, his big thing was, look what happens if you give them rights. Law and order will crack their heads. He also talked about those shaggies and long hairs and hippies. I'll give them a haircut, give them a bath. That's what he liked to say. He also liked to talk about the pointy-headed elites. These college-educated smarties who tell us how to live. They're the ones who are destroying this country. Of course, you had all these Ivy League graduates who told Lyndon Johnson that they should go to Vietnam. So maybe at a slight point there, but still. And then nuke North Vietnam and win the war. And if there's any doubt what he stood for, and people thought he might win as much as 20 to 30% of the vote. His rallies in the North would be full of people. Angry people. Angry. He tapped into this resentment. Nixon actually was thinking, how could I lose? The Democrats are split. Humphrey's falling apart. But then Humphrey started to catch up. And then this happened. Johnson announced we might have a peace agreement to end the war and pull American troops out. Peace. At least peace for America. We could claim victory. The first Paris peace agreement. But here's the deal. When he announced this, well, who freaked out when this announcement came? Which one of the candidates? Wallace to a lesser degree. Nixon completely panicked. And in private, top secret communications. Nixon contacted the president of South Vietnam. Knowing two. I feel like I'm sneezing. Two. I start to cough. I was trying to say two. It sounded really weird. Two was one of the generals. He'd be the last dictator. In 75, he would flee South Vietnam with millions of dollars and build a mansion in California. But they scuttled the peace agreement. And that means for America, for 4 more years of war, and for Vietnam, 7 more years of war. They scuttled this peace agreement. We know for a fact that Nixon did this. Nixon was willing to keep the war going on so he could be president. And then lie to the American public about it. Yeah. Well, remember the same FBI that was bugging Martin Luther King? They were bugging the Nixon campaign too. Incredibly illegally. Johnson knew and wanted to. And Johnson told Humphrey, and said, use this. He's a traitor. This is by definition treason. But Humphrey didn't do it. The wiretaps were illegal. Very illegal. Duplicitous, dishonest, and he couldn't do it. And I mean, yeah, this is one of the problems with this kind of liberal democracy thing. How do you deal with a society of free speech when you have people who are duplicitous and willing to do anything for power? How do you deal with that in a free society? Remember 1953 when Mossadegh was overthrown? He didn't want to deal with it. He thought we'd made a free society. Well, people used that freedom to take power. Gee, I wonder if we did that in Germany. Yeah. And we'll see that many times. And yes, it could happen here again. But 58,000 Americans are going to die in Vietnam. Almost half of them would die after this. So there's no president I'll tell you I hate. Okay, there's one person I did tell you I hate, John C. Fountain. Even though I do like to yell his name. But I hate Richard. This is why. There are other reasons I think to hate Nixon that are very valid. This is the reason why. And so with that, Nixon would win an incredibly close election. Wallace pulled enough votes for here. And Wallace pulled votes in Illinois. Blue is Republican here. Remember the blue state, red state thing didn't come across with 2000. This is one of my purposely finding one before 2000 so I could be honorary. I know it does look good. It's silly, but that's what I did. So the blue is Republican. I don't like the red state blue state. Don't like it. You don't know any difference. That's you probably I bet you always assumed it was always like that. Because why wouldn't you? Yeah. Why? I don't. Yes, I want plaid. It's not. It's such an inaccurate representation of the way voting really happens. But that's why it really bothers me.
Do you like the ones that they're so like clustered, like the big old circles based on population?
That's a little better. But even then, because we have electoral college and so it skews it. But you're right. I think that's better. Because look at wow, they won all this. Well, look at me electoral. Who lives here? I know we live in Montana. By the way, we're back to 4 electoral votes. Yes. Yeah, there's talk of that, but it's not to a tipping point to have a majority. So it doesn't mean much now. You can't really do it until you have a majority. Then it might actually make a difference. Who knows?
Psychology apply that represents like the senses, like your eyes are bigger, you feel more with your senses. For that, the map so that like California was
yeah, that's exactly what
Arizona was
about population.
So I mean, like the map was like disproportionately large. Like
no, I'm too much of a math guy to stand the disproportionate size. It would hurt my brain. So it was really close, and just a few votes differently. This is one of those what ifs. What if Humphrey would have been elected? Humphrey was this tireless fighter for, he's kind of an old New Dealer, civil rights. Who knows? He was definitely different than Nixon. Nixon economically was not as conservative as, let's say, Ronald Reagan or even Bill Clinton economically, or perhaps even Barack Obama economically. But other things, Nixon was pretty incredibly divisive. But Nixon had one big thing that happened as soon as he was elected. That summer, Apollo 11 supposedly landed on the moon. We know the truth, don't we? It was in a sound studio, Twickenham Studios, right in London. That is one of my favorite funny conspiracy theories that so many people believe. But Apollo 11, the first moon landing, and Nixon was president, so he could take advantage of that. Because that, we want to talk about something that brought the people together. Yeah.
Why London?
Because that's where 2001: A Space Odyssey is.
Which atmosphere was the London?
Huh? Which one was what?
What's the one in the college?
Oh, that's not. No, I can't remember which one, but I think about that Apollo. The 13 didn't.
Apollo 17.
I want to say Apollo. I think that was like the last one of second last. I think it's Apollo 17. Yeah, Apollo 13 didn't make it. They just about didn't make it at all. Yeah. Because it didn't all the missions after. Yeah, but there's Gemini, Mercury, Apollo. You're going to the stars. You're going to the stars. That's why. And the Soviets did not make it to the moon in the space race. Remember, after Khrushchev was ousted from power, they spent every penny they had on nuclear weapons and ICBMs, so they couldn't build missile. They couldn't build a rocket to the moon. And so Nixon could bask in this. And I should add, this did pass the Beatles as the most watched thing in history. It still is the most watched television program in American world history. There is somebody in this room who saw it. I don't know who that might be, but I've heard, huh? What was it like? That's all you remember? I'm not promising I remember a lot. Moving on. So, the beginnings of the environmental movement. And the Great Society had significant environmentalist elements. But remember, before we write Silent Spring, remember John Muir? He was what we call environmentalist today, but he was called a conservationist who influenced Teddy Roosevelt. Do you remember that? Or please, or I hope you please remember it now. They had questions about John Muir on the test. Yeah. And so I really want to make sure I mention it again. Now, of course, they're not going to this year, as I told you, right? But, all right. So Silent Spring, in many ways, would trigger this growing movement about environmental awareness because of the vast industrialization. But also, remember planned obsolescence? All the garbage. Garbage was going exponentially. People just throw the garbage out the street. I'm not making that up. There are mounds of garbage. I can remember being a kid driving down the brand new interstates and the medians going into beautiful Omaha, Nebraska. That's my grandparents lived near there. The medians would be just full of garbage. You couldn't see the grass. Which is just, I mean, I know there's still garbage. And there's still, like the yahoos who throw garbage out the parking lot. Please don't be one of those idiots. And if you are, quit being an idiot. Yeah, that's pretty good advice. Yeah, my dad told me that one time. Don't be an idiot. I remember that vividly. Silent Spring would be written by Rachel Carson. And this would trigger it because people could sense it, they could feel it. But there is this pesticide called DDT that was seen as the wonder pesticide in World War II. It would be used in farms all over. The big thing was it killed bullweeds, which were really hard to kill, and they were a big problem for cotton crops. But it killed every bug. And so all of these pests that were hurting production during the war would die in more crop fields. And think about soldiers and lice. You spray some DDT on that soldier, there's no lice anymore. It kills it right away. Yes, it's incredibly carcinogenic, as I found out by the 1960s, but Silent Spring wasn't about that. say, even though it didn't mention it. They weren't 100% sure when she wrote it. We know now it's carcinogenic. What was it doing? Yeah. Yeah, so it just basically shells would be mush of the ends. And so there'd be chips. So Silent Spring meaning no birds. No birds. And the bird populations were dropping like a rock, especially big birds. The bird they really noticed was the great condor, that huge vulture in California, was just about gone. What was it by the end of this? Going into the 1970s, there were 9 left. They did make a big rebound after they banned DDT. I should add there was a big conservative backlash against doing this, but this was a realization of what people are doing to the environment. And this would trigger this movement that was already kind of growing. Johnson's Great Society did start this with a Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But the biggie will come in 70. Passed over Nixon's opposition, but Nixon finally signed it. Because Democrats still greatly control Congress, huge Democratic majorities and Republican president. That would be the norm until the 1990s. There's this thing called NAFTA that's on your list. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But 1970, this would enforce environmental laws. Now the regulations are kind of convoluted. There aren't a lot of inspectors right now. And you can see there's a lot of conservative backlash. A bill just passed in the state yesterday that said Montana could no longer look at the environmental impact of climate changing gases. That is now going to be against the law in Montana. It was just passed yesterday in the House and the Senate, and the governor will sign it. And so there's still a lot of backlash against this. And so Montana was a relatively small part of the economy, but Montana's not alone in states like that. Yeah. It's a regulation as they see it in additional costs. But also it's an attack on them. There's a lot of that. And there's going to eventually be 3 major Clean Air Act and 2 Clean Water Acts. And you can really see the impact of the Clean Air Acts. Car pollution especially was extreme. Los Angeles, this was a clear day in 1968 in Los Angeles. It was infamous for the smog from cars. You can see it everywhere, but Los Angeles, by the way of the air. Missoula, up until the 80s, was infamous for being packed in with smog. Because of the valley, it has those 7 valleys coming in. And here's because of the Clean Air Act in 2005. This is a big deal, these Clean Air Acts, because that would lead to the catalytic converter that would begin to filter emissions of cars, and would lead to finally getting rid of lead in gasoline, totally by 1986. And violent crime has been dropping. Violent crime is so much lower now than it was in the 1990s, probably because of that. Little kids are susceptible to lead. Lead was, when I was your age, I probably sucked in 50 or 60 times more lead than you did. And so that has great effect on your not only your mental capabilities, but also your ability to tell right or wrong, and also leads to very violent behavior. So don't mess with me. I always tell the story, when I first started teaching, there were 2 or 3 fights every week in school. And since I was kind of a big guy, and that's why I was still coaching football, I was always one of the people they always called. In fact, it was always me and Mr. Carter. If you're right across, we would always be the ones going out in the cafeteria to break up a fight. Always. When's the last time there's been a fight in the school? Let's start one. Yeah, it's amazing how much different things are. I'm not saying there's still not crime, because there's about 3 times more guns than there was when I was your age, and crime did go up, but violent crime is still a lot lower than when I was your age. And the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, here's the river going into Lake Erie, it caught fire twice. One time it went over 2 weeks, the river is on fire. or maybe something really right. Yeah, that was a wake-up call when you can't put the water out. The southern third of Lake Michigan was covered with 2 to 3 inches of a white chemical foam that killed every single living thing in the southern third of Lake Michigan. If you've ever seen Lake Michigan, it's massive. It was all pollutants. It was all discharged from mostly chemical and steel plants. So air quality has gotten significantly better. This is the one. Lead is just, what happens with lead is just amazing. Lead is so terrible. Sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. Sulfur dioxide was leading to acid rain. Yes, literally raining acid. Not enough to actually really totally burn you alive, like when, but it could burn you. But the big thing was it was destroying plants. That's gone now. It was almost all from coal-fired electrical generators. Now, carbon dioxide is something different. Now, fortunately, in this state, we don't have to worry about such things anymore because we won't count. Yeah.
How is the EPA budget now?
The EPA budget is as billions of dollars. This is related in this is in 2015 dollars. And so it is, there was a slight increase in the what's called the Inflation Reduction Act. That was last year. But during the Trump years, it was cut dramatically. President Trump is a conservative. He doesn't believe in regulations. And the House of Representatives is trying to cut it dramatically right now. So one more thing. The swing wing. These are the kind of toys we had when I was a kid. You can't have one. Yeah, kids didn't cuss or fall. Yeah, they were rocking their skull around so much. Now I know what you're also saying. Well, that's. But what about science kits with uranium? They made a science kit. Look at what's in it. And uranium. Yeah. I did see that one. It was great.
Yeah, it's so funny.
So on Monday, we'll do women's rights, and then I'll get as far as I can on Monday. What time is the review session? 6 p.m. in the evening. Why not? Should we go morning?
No, 6 p.m. in the morning.
Yeah, 6 p.m. in the morning. Figure it out. And I will come in at lunch, I'll answer questions, but I gotta get, there's gotta be people here. All right. We'll see you. Have a good day. That's swing day. You with another toy? I wanted one of these so bad. When? Yeah, Monday I'm just gonna finish it as far as. Like this. Okay, I want a rock'em sock'em you robot. I wanted one.
There's like
And all this is. These are the things. Only person needs everything they've ever had plus. So it's basically your need for me. So just talk to the people. Enough more. And it's one of those that Oh. I knew something about this. It's, yeah. So you can change diapers. You skipped yesterday.
I skipped many days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I missed like yesterday and 2 days ago, I think.
Hey, you were on Monday too. Where were you?
No, I was here Monday.
What
Yeah, I
day
was
is
here
today?
Monday. Friday. I missed Tuesday. I was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
That's what you did.
There it
Yeah.
is. Something like that. Yeah.
What were you?
I,
Oh, okay. How you doing?
I'm gonna.
Okay.
Same one. Yeah. Was it just notes? And I meant to do
Notes and I, did you get this? Practice sets.
Perfect.
And one more time. So. Where's it? Here's, okay, we're not gonna get that. And I'm gonna go as far as I can. But it's 5% of test time. This is everything that's ever been, so. Got 30, 31, I saw this on the, I didn't post that. And just, basics, I'll, in the review session, I'll call you about. Great, thank you. Yeah, it's one of the things. Yeah, we have so much.
Yeah, I just keep very.
Yeah. It's the swing game. That's really nice about phones, I gotta admit. You can't check the news very easily. Sometimes that's a bad thing.
No. Oh. Beyond.
I was.
A huge. Bills is the Montana legislature, right? No news. No news is maybe. Okay. All right, so if you did do those, give me a sec.